Hi everyone. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. As some of you may already know, I am a flared user on the Ask Historian subreddit, and what that means is I answer questions that have to do with tanks and military history from time to time. Now, there was a question that was asked recently by user nelsonbt that was quite interesting, and I thought I'd talk about it in a video. So nelsonbt asks, how many miles or kilometers was considered a Sherman tank's lifespan? I read once that Sherman tanks could go 500 miles before the engine fell apart. Presumably, it would need a major overhaul. Is this baseless? This is quite an interesting question. As you probably already know, Sherman tanks used a variety of different engines. The first engine was the Wright Whirlwind or Wright Radial. The designation was R975, and the first type of this engine to be used in tanks was the EC2. So the EC2 was used in the medium tank M3, mostly known as the Lee, or this here is the Grant. And this engine was quite good, but the problem with it was that it needed too much high-octane gasoline. And the first thing that happens in war is that all the high-octane gasoline goes to power aircraft for the Air Force, so the tanks are left with nothing. American engineers developed a version of this engine that used lower octane gas. It was called the R975-C1, and it was used in the Sherman tank. This is the medium tank M4, but it was also used on the medium tank M4A1, medium tank M4A5, if you consider the Ram a kind of Sherman, and a bunch of other self-propelled guns and other vehicles that use this chassis. In a test held in late 1943 and ending in early 1944, the 975 ran for, on average, 166 hours, and not a single engine made it past 200 hours. It was also quite maintenance intensive. In late 1942, there was another test of a similar nature, where 6 out of 10 tanks with this kind of engine ran for the full 400 hours, but the first tank to drop out at only 11 hours. Now, the thing here is that these tanks were allowed to have unlimited maintenance, and you could even replace engine accessories as long as you didn't replace any parts internal to the engine. So the vastly varying performance probably has to do with the amount of maintenance that could be performed or the amount of spare parts that were on hand. Now, the R975C1 was not the last modification of the engine. There was an improvement called R975C4. Engines could either be built to this standard or they could be modernized from the R975C1 during overhaul. During trials, these C4 engines ran an average of 209 hours, and a C1 overhaul to be a C4 ran for 222 hours. This is pretty good, but not quite as good as the other Sherman engines managed. In less ideal circumstances, the engine did not last for anywhere as long as this. The first Sherman tank given to the British ran for only 65 hours before the engine broke down. Presumably, the quality improved with time since reports in North Africa state that a Sherman tank would run for between 180 and 200 hours, given that an engine overhaul was performed at 100 hours. In Italy, this number went up to 225 hours. Unfortunately, they don't specify what kind of engine this was, so presumably it was a C4. Now, there were a couple of stinkers here and there. For example, the British 38th Armored Brigade complained that their radial engines would drop off in power drastically after just 400 miles of running. Unfortunately, they don't give the time, but this would be about 40 hours. The Americans had issues with them as well. For example, the 743rd Independent Tank Battalion reported that its radial engines were going out of use very quickly. For example, one engine had to be returned after just 10 hours of use, another after just 30 hours. Now, the R975 was just one engine that was used by Sherman tanks. There's also the GM 6046 engine, which was used on the M4A2 tanks, such as this one here. The US Army didn't really use them that much. They were mostly used by British and Soviet troops, but this engine was quite a bit more reliable. So in the trials that I mentioned, one engine lasted for the full 400 hours, and the rest broke down at an average of 300 hours. So as you can see, it ran for quite a bit longer. In Africa, unfortunately, I don't have the lifespan of an M4A2 engine in hours, but the British reported that it was good for about 1,500 miles. Now, to compare, the M4A1 was considered good up to 700 to 900 miles, so you can see that it's quite a bit more reliable. In Italy, these tanks were reported to have a significant drop in performance after about 1,000 miles of running, but as far as I can tell, this was not because of the engine. This was probably because of the dust affecting transmission and running gear and other components. The Soviets, as I mentioned, used this tank as well, and they, of course, left their own impressions. Early M4A2 engines came with faulty injectors, which made them break down after only a couple of hours of use. The British actually ran into this same problem. Their solution was to take every engine apart and to clean the injectors manually. The Americans insisted that this was not necessary, but that's the only way they could get acceptable performance out of them. By the end of the war, the M4A2 was an incredibly reliable tank. The Soviets estimated that one tank would run for between 250 and 300 hours and cover between 2,000 and 2,500 kilometers. This was about on par with a T-34-85 tank. That wasn't it for engines used by Sherman tanks. There was then the M4A3 tank, which used the Ford GAA engine. This was the Sherman tank favored by Americans and also used on other vehicles such as this GMC M36 tank destroyer. So this engine was not quite as reliable. No, none of them lasted for the full 400-hour run, but they lasted to 323 hours on average, which is still very good and much better than the radial engine. The British also got an M4A3 to test, even though they didn't use it in combat. Their engine broke down after 253 hours, so a little bit lower than the Americans managed with unlimited spare parts, but still pretty good. Now, there was another Sherman engine that unfortunately I don't have a model to show you. This was the Chrysler multibank used in the M4A4 tank. The M4A4 tank was mostly used by the British, which were first horrified by its ridiculous complexity, and who wouldn't be? It was essentially 5 car engines stapled together to create a 30-cylinder monstrosity. However, trials showed that it was actually quite reliable, and in American trials, this was shown as well, since 3 out of 4 of these multi-bank engines finished the 400-hour trial, and the one that broke down only broke down at 339 hours. Now, you might wonder what this actually means in terms of real-life performance. The British, in their maintenance standards, lumped all Sherman tanks together regardless of what engine they had. So, as you could probably tell, the real-life performance wasn't that different. The Sherman tanks that ran for under 1,000 miles were considered Category 1. Sherman tanks that ran under 2,000 miles were considered Category 2. Now, other British tanks that were in the same boat were the Valentine and the Cromwell. Other British tanks were not anywhere as reliable. For example, the Churchill was considered to be Category 2 after just 400 miles of service, and the Matilda after only 350 miles. There is another trial where the performance of Sherman tanks could be compared in real conditions with other tanks. The Soviet Sixth Guards tank army that was driving into Manchuria had both Sherman tanks and T-34-85s as well as vehicles on its chassis. Now, this was no picnic. These tanks had to drive up to 1,600 kilometers in searing heat. It would be up to 45 degrees at noon. The rain would wash away the roads. If there was no rain, the dust would make you clean air filters in the tanks every 2 or 3 hours of driving. It was absolutely grueling. However, when the operation concluded, 87% of all Sherman tanks, or 161 tanks out of 185, were still in service. This is the same percentage for T-34-85 tanks, 87%. So as you can see, the Sherman's reliability was indeed world-class. If you want to learn more about the performance of the Sherman tank and the Red Army, both its performance in combat and its reliability, as well as other impressions that Soviet troops left, check out my upcoming book, Sherman Tanks of the Red Army, available for pre-order now on Amazon or on the publisher's website. Link in the description below. Alright, that's it. If you have any questions you would like me to answer, feel free to email me at tankarchives@gmail.com or leave them in the comments under this video and I will get to them next time.